So good evening, everybody in Asia, and good morning to those of you joining us from the United States or from a different time zone. So welcome, I can see Richard from Thailand, right? And Wayne, Andrew in Hong Kong. Andrew, haven't seen you for a while.
Hi,
welcome.
Paul.
Hi, good to see you. SK from New Delhi. Are you, or Singapore? New Delhi, right? Yeah. Okay, welcome. So we're honoured to have Chris Aukland presenting to us this evening. Chris is going to give us an update on the recruitment market in Hong Kong, trends in terms of jobs, salaries, and so on, and some insights on the impact of COVID on hiring and remote working. So thank you very much, Chris, for taking time out from your busy schedule to come and present to us here. And I pass over to you for your presentation. Just as a point of admin, very quickly, sorry. Questions and answers. Chris is happy to take questions during his presentation, and at the end we'll have an opportunity for Q&A as well. So sorry, Chris, over to you. Thank you.
Sure. No, thanks a lot, Paul, and good evening, everyone in Asia, and good morning to those elsewhere. I do have a few slides to talk through, so just bear with me, and I'll share my deck. Sorry, there we go. Okay, Paul, we can see that. Everyone, we can see that.
Yes, very clear.
Thumbs up. Okay, perfect. Okay. First of all, thanks to Paul and Charlotte for inviting me along this evening. As sort of Paul mentioned, I'm just going to give you a bit of an overview about current trends, what we're seeing in Hong Kong, impact of COVID, remote working, and sort of how travel restrictions are sort of impacting hiring here. Thought I'd just allow me a very brief moment to introduce our business, and then I thought I'd also just perhaps try and break some of the trends we're doing in relation to finance and accounting across both the commerce and industry and banking spaces, and then talk about sort of what we're seeing in terms of hiring practices, what we're thinking in terms of our future forecast, and then some recommendations for employers as well. I'm not going to go into massive detail about myself. Everyone's seen the bio. Suffice to say, I've been out in Hong Kong for 18 years. I think I've known Paul for the vast majority of those, Paul, I believe. But I obviously sort of started my career in Accenture and then in sort of finance recruitment before moving into sort of managing our business. But I run the Ambition business for Asia, so I'm also happy to commentate and give my views about sort of what we're seeing across Singapore and Malaysia as well. In terms of Ambition, we're an Australian recruitment business. Coverage across Australia, Asia, and the UK, and sort of our sort of specialist areas cover both banking and financial services, finance and accounting, technology, sales and marketing, and supply chain. So in terms of scale, about 200 people globally, 40 people here in Hong Kong. So there you go. That's my 1 minute sell. Sort of key trends. I think it's very clear, we've had, a couple of very tumultuous years in Hong Kong. We had sort of 2019 where we saw the, social unrest really impacting the economy here. Certainly towards the latter half of 2019, it made doing business here quite challenging. So that, and then that was very closely followed, by COVID-19. So it hasn't been a great story for since that point. We saw the pandemic, as it did in many locations, leading to higher unemployment. So the employment rate, unemployment rate in Hong Kong did peak, highest it's been since GFC. And what you saw, instead of sort of hiring, was a lot of focus around cost saving. We saw a significant amount of restructuring, some businesses laying off staff, those most severely impacted, and also things like enforcing sort of 4-day weeks, enforcing annual leave being taken, salary freezes, etc. Not all industry sectors, but obviously those most severely impacted were sort of the aviation, hospitality, F&B, travel, tourism, retail. Obviously, we did see some sectors, doing extremely well throughout COVID and benefiting. But again, broadly, it wasn't a particularly positive story from an employment perspective, 2020. Fast forward to the start of 2021, I think certainly in the first half of this year we have seen a more positive outlook. I'm not going to sit here and say we're in a really buoyant job market, but certainly in terms of some of the metrics that we look at as a business, we've certainly seen things improving. So you can see certainly confidence returning, certainly for us in terms of movement in the market. Candidates are happier to change jobs now. If you rewind 12 months, if you were sitting in a secure role, it was very unlikely that you would change employers because there's just too much risk attached. So if we look at some of the key metrics, we measure sort of the number of live open roles that we have sort of on our books at the moment. We're up about 60% year on year. Actual hiring, so that's actual placements that we're making with our clients. We're up over 30%. Actually, sort of we did this deck a couple of weeks ago. Actually, after June was actually a very positive month, highest number of hires since 2019 across our business. So that just gives you some indication that sort of conditions are improving. And I think a key one to sort of point out here is that the number of applicants, so job seekers in the market, is also significantly up. Now there's two parts to this. Obviously, there are people, more people looking for jobs because of sort of unemployment, but at the same time, there generally is more confidence in terms of changing employers at the moment. So all very positive metrics. We've definitely seen an increase in temporary and contract hiring above what we've seen in the permanent market. That's fairly typical when you come out of a period of sort of instability. We saw it post-SARS, we saw it post-GFC, where companies are slightly more risk averse and will therefore prefer to take on people on a temporary basis as opposed to a permanent basis. So definitely something we expect to see continue. Obviously not directly related to sort of the finance space, but absolutely the sort of busiest area in Hong Kong in terms of hiring has been technology. Obviously the pandemic has accelerated a lot of organizational plans around technology, digitalisation. So there's been a lot of focus on digital transformation, and therefore technology hiring has been sort of the sort of top of the agenda for a lot of businesses here. On the slightly more sort of negative side, we are seeing some relocation out of talent out of Hong Kong. It's obviously been well publicised in the press around sort of the security law. So we have seen a percentage of sort of the local population looking to take advantage of things like the B&O passport initiative or securing visas for China. So that's something we are seeing at the moment. And then you've also got limited incoming talent, obviously due to the travel restrictions and COVID. It just makes it very difficult at the moment for professionals to come into Hong Kong. And again, what you are seeing is probably that Hong Kong has lost a little bit of its sheen in terms of the expatriate posting that it used to be. If you are sitting in Australia or the UK at the moment, the way that Hong Kong is shown in the press and the media, it's probably not again top of the list in terms of expatriate postings for people based in those locations now. So again, whether or not that's a long-term issue and whether that impacts sort of incoming talent remains to be seen. So if we delve perhaps a little bit deeper into what we're seeing in sort of the commerce and industry space here, who's hiring at the moment, we're certainly seeing decent levels of hiring activity across these sort of industry sectors here. Hong Kong listed conglomerates, real estate, pharmaceutical, FMCG, actually retail businesses have sort of started hiring again, but this is mainly those with Asia Pacific headquarters based out of Hong Kong or Greater China sort of offices here. If for those retail businesses that have a reliance on footfall in Hong Kong from the mainland market, then obviously they're still struggling. And I think obviously some of the professional services, law firms have started to hire again this year, and also in technology. The technology firms are also doing well, and we've seen an increased volume of hiring from tech firms. If we look at sort of specifically within finance, we've seen demand this year in terms of sort of general accounting, controllership, tax, credit control, financial planning and analysis, and also finance transformation goes back to what I mentioned earlier. We are seeing Chinese language skills being more and more sought after from our client base. So again, does remain to be seen if that is a trend that continues. And I think what's very clear is senior level hiring, sort of CFO hiring, certainly in 2020 was very slow, has picked up a little this year, but there's still not a huge amount of movement in the market. But what we're definitely hearing is that sort of the importance of a highly capable CFO and effective finance function has been more critical than ever throughout the pandemic in terms of keeping the lights on, managing risk, cash management, etc. We're also sort of hearing from a lot of our clients. I would probably, to this group, I would suspect it's well known, but the role of the CFO is definitely evolving. Not only are it's the technical expertise, but the CFO is now expected to be a sort of master of data and technology, and is also taking a much more critical role in terms of driving companies' digital activities and really acting as that sort of agent of change within the business. So again, with the pandemic, it has accelerated a lot of companies' focus around sort of technology and digital transformation. Guys, do jump in. Happy to answer questions as we go, if anyone wants to. But if not, I'll just keep carrying on. In terms of what we're seeing across sort of banking and financial services, so 2020, again, go back was a pretty slow year for us. There were some pockets of higher activity, but certainly this year, we have seen much more positive sentiment. In terms of who's hiring at the moment, we are seeing sort of a fair bit of activity across the fintech and the cryptocurrency space. Obviously, there's been a fair high degree of interest in that sector over the course of this year, although obviously it's particularly volatile, and a lot of discussion around regulation at the moment. Obviously the virtual banks with the licensing have set up here, and obviously they've had to hire. And then sort of more in terms of some of the sort of larger US and European investment banks, we're not seeing huge amounts of hiring, but there are pockets. But we are seeing more across sort of buy-side asset management, insurance, China-based financial institutions, and sort of online brokerage and e-trading platforms. specifically within sort of banking and financial services. So, in terms of the sort of finance skills in demand that we're seeing from our client base is things like expense management, regulatory reporting, FP&A, business partnering, and again, sort of that finance transformation skill set. If we look more broadly across banking, it's been, I think, well publicised in the press here that although there's been, some banks closing down certain sectors, wealth management, project and change management, and digital transformation professionals are very much in high demand. I'd echo what I sort of mentioned around sort of the CFO and how the role of the CFO is evolving. But again, within banking, what we're seeing is that sort of Mandarin language skills are, especially highly sought after, and certainly across the front office for the majority of banks we hire for, they're almost a prerequisite at the moment. Right, so let me just share with you a little bit about what we're seeing in terms of hiring and working practices. And again, Hong Kong was probably in the best position out of most countries in Asia to really embrace remote working practices, because in 2019, obviously a lot of organizations had really already moved towards making remote working part of their, part of the sort of, how they operate due to the social unrest. So actually it was relatively quick uptake from businesses here, but what we have seen is that there's been very much widespread adoption of technology, and this is not only as sort of a remote working, but as part of the recruitment, screening and onboarding process. So what was new to me in 2020, and I don't think I'd really seen it before, was we saw numerous cases of professionals being hired completely virtually, so without any face-to-face interviews at all, and actually onboarded into their companies without actually ever having set foot in the office. And we saw numerous examples of this, where in actual fact it was the first time they'd been into the office in 2021. But what we're also seeing is that, ongoing, we are absolutely seeing this as something that is here to stay. So, approximately 50% of the interviews that we're arranging currently are still virtual. This is very much driven by sort of it being more of an accepted way of doing initial interviews, but also because a lot of our client base as well is still operating a sort of hybrid remote working model to some extent. So as well as sort of recruitment, I think what's very clear in Hong Kong, as is globally, is flexible working is here to stay. Now, there are obviously some fairly strong opinions either way, and every single individual I ask seems to have a slightly different opinion about this. It's obviously been well publicised that there's some companies, certainly some of the larger technology companies, Google, Facebook, Amazon, Microsoft, have come out and sort of announced that they are going to operate a work from home policy indefinitely, or some type of hybrid model, which typically includes sort of 50% of the time remote working. On the other side of that, though, you've also seen some very high-profile organisations. I'm thinking Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, etc., that have come out and been very clear that they want professionals back in the office. Here in Hong Kong, I'd say broadly around 50% of our client base is still working remotely or offers some type of remote working option for their employees. And what is interesting, I think, and is that sort of hybrid work models, and therefore what that means for office real estate in Hong Kong is a big question mark. Just picked up on sort of Microsoft's work trend index, which stated that sort of 65% of Hong Kong business leaders plan to redesign their offices. So sort of the anecdotal feedback that I can share as well on that is when I'm talking to some of the larger real estate players here. They are very, very busy at the moment, but it's mainly due to companies downsizing in terms of taking less office space because they're operating a hybrid work model. And again, you've seen companies like HSBC, Manulife, etc., come out and announce they are redesigning their workplaces accordingly. So it is a bit of a mix at the moment, but we definitely are seeing, I think flexible working is here to stay for the future. What else are we seeing in terms of hiring processes? We are definitely seeing that there are lengthier processes happening. Companies still are operating with a degree of caution. It's certainly within banks and financial institutions. We are going through more rounds of interviews, etc., and companies are slightly more cautious about pulling the trigger in terms of hiring. And what we also saw, possibly less so in the last couple of months, but certainly at the back end of 2020 and the first quarter in 2021, was that certainly approvals processes were tightening, and they were almost going up in terms of a layer, in terms of a level to get approval on new hires. We are seeing increased geographic flexibility about the location of roles. That's very much become apparent. We've received numerous mandates in the last few months where the mandate from the client has been, I want to find this individual, but in terms of where that individual is based, I don't really mind, whether it's in Hong Kong or Singapore or elsewhere within Asia. So we are definitely seeing that as a possible strategy for organizations, especially when companies are facing a little bit of a challenge in terms of securing overseas talent to come into Hong Kong. It is possible. I've had spoken with clients here that have relocated individuals from Europe and Australia into Hong Kong throughout the pandemic. Obviously it's not easy, travel restrictions, just that, the desire to want to move here at the moment, but it is possible. But again, it's obviously not easy, and there is a much more reduced incoming pool of talent that we're seeing at the moment. So definitely some challenges in trying to find people from overseas. I think broadly the pandemic has opened up some quite long-term questions. I'm not going to suggest that I have the answers to those, but I do feel like organizations longer term will potentially start to look at work from anywhere strategies. We have seen examples of that. We saw, just last week, we had a client approach us that was keen to hire a position based out of Australia to support Hong Kong, purely because they want a quite specific tech skill set, and they feel that they will be better able to secure that talent in Australia. And they're more than happy to set that individual up from home, etc., give them some support in terms of buying the technology, office furniture, etc., but then working to support Hong Kong. So and again, even our own organization, we do have examples now of people being based outside of their home location and supporting offices. So again, something that could become more common. And again, this is something I was just debating with another senior individual recently from the sort of from a law firm, and we were just talking about employment contracts and what does it really mean for employment contracts in terms of the work from anywhere and also flexible working. Does the standard Monday to Friday 9 to 5 sort of employment contract, will it fundamentally have to change in the future? So again, I think these are not things that I claim to have the answers to, but are really interesting possibilities. And sorry, last bullet point on here, but it is something that certainly we are seeing a lot more focus on than certainly I've seen in Hong Kong or across Asia during my time here, but that has been much more of a focus of employers around mental health. I think it's become apparent that, in terms of working from home, you have employees turning the computer on at 8 a.m. in the morning and not clocking off until 11, 12 at night a lot of the time, and also the expectation that when you're working from home, you almost have to respond immediately to every single message and email that comes through, and therefore the sort of raised level of stress that brings. So it's definitely something that we've seen become more of a common discussion point from our clients. So again, will be interesting to see how organizations address that. Okay, looking ahead. In terms of our forecast for the future, so I'd probably expect more of the same for the next 6 months. Again, I just want to go back to what I said. I'm not saying we're in a really buoyant market. It's all relative. Obviously we're in a much better place than we were at the same time last year. But, again, you rewind a further sort of 12, 18 months to 2018. Are we really hitting the same levels of hiring? No, we're not. But there has been a sort of steady increase in hiring and overall confidence this year, and we'd probably expect that to continue. There may well be a few bumps in the road. If we get another COVID outbreak, etc. I think a really good example of that is the Australia market at the moment. We just had a really, really strong couple of months in our Australia business where hiring was really back to pre-pandemic levels, and then obviously subsequently Sydney is now in the midst of an extended lockdown, and that's really impacted business there. So again, maybe we'll have some bumps in the road, but generally at the moment for Hong Kong, we would expect hiring to continue to increase. Similarly to what I said earlier, we definitely expect to see the contract and interim market increase over permanent hiring. And I think more longer term, once the vaccine sort of percentage in Hong Kong gets up to where we want it to be, and once sort of travel restrictions are lifted and confidence is restored, I would fully expect a very rapid uptick in terms of hiring. So lots of organizations wanting to take advantage, and lots of companies wanting to be on the front foot in terms of hiring people. Now, obviously, if I had a crystal ball, I'd absolutely love to tell you when I think that will be. I think I probably sat on a similar sort of presentation at the same time last year and probably said, midpoint 2021. So that's obviously turned out not to be the case, but obviously with vaccine rates going up slowly in most Asia locations, the expectation I would hope is that that should be at some point in 2022 and not beyond. I think Hong Kong, there does remain some uncertainty. It's not just around the pandemic, but obviously, the ongoing impact of the security law. We have the China and the US, China-Australia relationships. So it will, again, the impact of those business relationships on the market here remains to be seen. And it also remains to be seen around the outflow of talent. I think we are sort of expecting that to continue in the short term. And again, we are going to see, just because of the restrictions, we are going to see less incoming talent from overseas. So my own expectation actually is that, we would probably expect to see a bit of a crunch in terms of the talent market in the next 12 to 18 months, because what you're going to see is that a lot of companies are going to want to hire as the economy improves and as business conditions do improve. And we're going to see very much a lack of talent here. So it may actually benefit job seekers. You could see, obviously it's moving to much more towards a highly candidate-driven market where, they would possibly have multiple opportunities, but also it would tend to, drive up salary levels, drive up benefits and bonuses, etc. General expectations from the businesses that we're speaking to is that, bonus levels and salary rises, would be going back to sort of pre-pandemic levels in 2022. That obviously doesn't include the most badly hit industry sectors. So, obviously there are still a lot of organizations in Hong Kong really struggling, go back to the aviation, tourism, travel, etc. But again, for a lot of businesses where, they are, have done well this year, we do probably expect bonuses to go back to similar pre-pandemic levels at the end of the year. I think for those of us who are based here, there's obviously a lot of discussion from the government around the GBA, and again, there's a question mark about what that means if that does become a reality in terms of freedom of movement within the GBA region, what that means for talent pools. Will organisations in Hong Kong be able to tap into much wider talent pools or set up offices within that area to tap into talent pools, anywhere within that space? So again, I do feel like a lot of organisations may look to take advantage, of the whole GBA project. And then if I look perhaps a little bit more specifically at finance, again, we probably expect sort of steady demand, within the finance and accounting space. I think tech-savvy professionals, absolutely technology skills are highly sought after. In terms of what we would expect to see, it'd be sort of FP&A, that business partnering type requirement is you would expect to see continue. And again, in some niche areas, insolvency, restructuring, obviously, as some organisations that potentially didn't do as well during the pandemic, these sorts of skill sets would also come into play. But also go back to what I sort of talked about in terms of business transformation. Again, I think that sort of area and skill set is still going to be very much in demand over the short to mid-term. In terms of sort of senior mandates, again, it's been relatively slow across the market here in Hong Kong, but we would expect that to slowly tick up as market conditions improve, and then you'd probably expect to see more movement in the market. So, more sort of senior level individuals prepared to change employers. Obviously some people have hung in there throughout the social unrest, throughout the pandemic, and may, as the market improves and confidence returns, may look to make a change, and that will create more movement in the market. So again, haven't seen that yet, but we possibly expect to see that in the next few months. And again, don't want to sort of repeat myself, but again, we probably expect the role of CFO to evolve. We are seeing some organisations, offshoring transactional accounting roles. I can certainly say that in our Malaysia business, which has a dedicated shared services team, we are seeing, a far greater increase in terms of recruitment into shared services there. So again, that's these are pretty much global teams that support global businesses, be it in Asia or beyond. But certainly organisations are looking at ways of streamlining cost, and that is obviously one option. Again, in line with the sort of GBA focus, I do feel like Mandarin language skills do become even more important in the future. Okay, last slide, guys, stay with me. So if anyone is hiring, I think recommendations for employers that we would have, I think talent retention, absolutely, along with attraction, has to be prioritized at the moment. I think if you are planning to hire, at any point, this year, I would strongly advise, business leaders to act now, because again, going to what I mentioned before, I do feel like there is going to be a little bit of a crunch in talent as the market improves. I go back to what I mentioned earlier, and what we're sort of seeing from our candidate pool is that sort of remote working, flexible working practices are almost, it's almost assumed now from a lot of professionals that that organizations can offer these. So again, embracing those work practices if at all possible. And obviously understanding that, there are still businesses out there that are very much sort of fighting to stay above water. Even if salary increases are not possible, then offering career advancement, additional responsibility to their internal high performers, L&D opportunities is incredibly important. And if, obviously, again, if organizations are looking to potentially offshore certain roles or automate due to sort of advanced technology, is it an opportunity to upskill the internal talent pool? So never wasting a good crisis. Just some of the things I'd look at suggesting if you are looking to hire. Okay, and that's pretty much it from me. Paul, I'm happy to. I've got to see there's a question in the chat. So we've got a question from Richard. How are companies handling the...
I'm not sure if you can hear me. My connection seems to go a bit bad, but if you do have questions from any of the participants, please go ahead.
Guys, if Paul, your line's a little bit, it's not great, unfortunately. But if anyone has questions, please just shout or put them in the chat. Richard's got a question: how are companies handling the work permit and dual country employment tax issues? That's a very good question, Richard, and unfortunately, I am probably not qualified to answer that. I can. I mean, honestly, again, that is a question that I would have. I don't know if we've got any tax specialists on the line. Certainly, I think there's a little bit of organisations perhaps just fudging it at the moment, but I do know that that the tax issue is going to be an issue. So,
yeah, that was the direction I was going. Not so much what are they doing, but are they doing and considering anything? Because I think in that situation, the organizations will be a little ahead of the tax authorities in what they're planning to do.
Well, Rich, I'd love to get some insight, and if you have any insights around that, because we ourselves as an organisation do have some individuals that work outside of their sort of home office jurisdiction at the moment, but it's more temporary. But it is obviously more down to the individual about reporting the tax in their local jurisdiction. But it's a very interesting point. If you're employed in Hong Kong, out of Hong Kong, but doing a job, and you're living in Australia, or you're living in Thailand, or living in wherever, where you're paying tax. Yeah, I'm afraid I don't have the answers. But any. I mean, I'm just curious about any examples anyone's seen on that.
I think in some of the countries, what happens is it all depends upon the location where you provide the services. And if the location that you're providing the service is outside of the country, there's probably a tax exemption at the base country where you're working from. But I'm not too sure either. So this is something small I know, so I just thought I'll mention that. Especially in cases of indirect taxes like that and everything, that is for sure. That there's no taxation in the local country if services are provided abroad, outside of the country.
Well, the one thing I do know is in Thailand, because Thailand tends to attract a lot of digital nomads, and the Thai Labor Department takes an extremely narrow view of the definition of what work is. So extremely restrictive. Basically, if you breathe for money, you're working. And theoretically, if you're working for an organization that is not domiciled in Thailand and registered for taxes in Thailand, you're supposed to self-report when whatever income you earn is repatriated is brought into Thailand. but almost nobody does. I mean, I can't think of ever hearing of anybody actually self-reporting that kind of income.
Well, you know how the tax department could be, they could twist all the laws the way they want it at whatever point of time. So that's how it works.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting topic. Certainly, I mean, I suppose in terms of the jurisdictions, I know. I mean, obviously know that if you are working in Hong Kong, but you're working for a company working in Hong Kong, but you're based in Australia, then obviously you still need to pay Australia tax. Yeah, that's very clear. So, it is, but so the specific example that I mentioned earlier, that individual obviously will have to pay Australia tax, but be still supporting a business up here. But he will be more than happy to because he's still based in Australia. So. Paul's asked how I look at Hong Kong and Singapore versus other markets. I mean, Singapore, I mean, just to share with you a little bit about our business there. Again, similarly to Hong Kong, 2020 was a very challenging year for us in Singapore. Volume of hires was substantially down. Movement in the market was very, very low. So, there was not a lot of hiring going on. It has certainly improved this year. There are, obviously Singapore, the Ministry of Manpower there has put in policies which are, directed at employing local Singaporeans above expats, and they've brought in some fairly stringent requirements about around employment permits, and even people moving into Singapore on an employment permit. Obviously spousal visas have been sort of temporarily put on hold, etc. So it definitely is making it more challenging to hire. Sort of our business pre-pandemic in Singapore, probably about 50% of what we did as a business was moving expatriates either within Singapore or from elsewhere into Singapore. It's just the nature of the market. Probably it's 90% of what we do in Hong Kong is local, but in Singapore it does tend to be a much more international sort of candidate base. So therefore it has impacted our business substantially. Now, in my opinion, that really has to be a temporary measure, but it's just about how long that is in place, because otherwise eventually companies will not want to set up in Singapore or not want to continue to grow in Singapore because they won't have access to the right talent pools. But for now it is putting a bit of strain on hiring. It's also putting a little bit of strain on sort of the expatriate community there, because I can share some some examples where unfortunately we've had certain individuals where their children have left Singapore and then been unable to return because they aren't PR, etc., and therefore have had to look at different locations, etc. So it's certainly putting a bit of a strain, I think, on the sort of expatriate population there. But again, hopefully, vaccination rates in Singapore are a little bit higher than in Hong Kong. They are certainly making some more sort of noise in the press in terms of sort of aiming for their national day and then hopefully reopening up travel, etc. So again, reasonably optimistic that we're not going to be sitting here at the same point next year and sort of discussing the same issues.
Chris, hi, it's Andrew here. Nice to see you again.
And you.
Thanks for your background on what's going on in Hong Kong. That's very helpful. When you talked about digitalization as one of the key trends, in your experience, in your own mandates or just general experience, is a lot of that done? Because you also mentioned I guess the prevalence or higher rates of contract temporary hiring at the moment versus permanent. Do you see quite a lot of digitalization roles, such as developing mobile apps or obviously other forms of digitalization, being with sort of highly skilled people who are contracted maybe for 6-9 month projects? Or do they tend to recruit them as technology officer internally?
I mean, it's a combination of both, Andrew. I think what actually I suppose from a preference perspective, certainly some of the banks and financial institutions would rather take these individuals on contract roles, but that particular skill set that you mentioned there, sort of, whether it's development or, development of mobile apps or, all of that space is so incredibly hot at the moment in terms of demand. So if you are an experienced developer at the moment with the relevant, programming languages, etc., then it's very likely you can get multiple job offers. We had, I can give you an example. This week we had someone's salary increase, and it's probably the highest I've ever seen someone get an increase. They went for, I think it's something like 150% salary increase from a relatively low base as a developer. They had multiple job offers and ended up getting a substantially higher pay. So it just gives you some example, some sort of sense of a little bit how crazy the technology market is at the moment, and there's just such a lack of supply in that space. So again, I go back to sort of the talent crunch, what that means in terms of the what GBA means for the sort of access to that talent pool. The government is trying to do some stuff around this. I sat on a I suppose a similar seminar with Cyberport recently. And I've forgotten the name of the actual scheme, but the government is sort of helping bring expatriate tech talent into Hong Kong and helping to subsidize salaries if it's for certain type of tech roles. But again, that's not going to really probably make much of a dent in terms of sort of demand here. So I know some companies that we've been speaking to have been talking about, instead of hiring in Hong Kong, hiring in other locations or potentially offshoring certain talent pools into different locations, etc.
Okay, no, that's helpful. So is it, perhaps it's mainly because of the pandemic, are you aware of an increase in mainland developer talent into Hong Kong already, or that's something that hasn't really happened for one reason or another?
I think definitely so look at the start. If we go back to the start of 2019, Richard, absolutely that was the case. We were sort of seeing more talent from across the border coming into Hong Kong. Don't think that's necessarily true at the moment. Again, we don't track stats on this sort of stuff. You'd probably have to look at sort of government immigration websites to get that sort of data, but we're not seeing it at the moment. But I do feel like the government is trying to encourage overseas tech talent to come here, because they do acknowledge that there is quite a big gap in terms of the talent pool here.
Okay, thank you.
One question, one thing what I realized from your presentation, as well as some of the things that we've been hearing, is that so unless you have a Mandarin background and at least a speaking knowledge of Mandarin, probably is becoming increasingly difficult to get jobs in countries like Hong Kong or even Singapore, for that matter. What's your view on that?
Yeah, it's something we get asked a lot, SK, that I think there is certainly often a degree of frustration here around sort of language skills being sort of a preferred sort of skill set or sometimes prerequisite. I still feel there are a huge number of opportunities for non-Chinese speakers here in Hong Kong. There's lots of industry sectors and lots of roles where Chinese skills are not required. But I do believe that it is a trend that will continue, that as Hong Kong naturally becomes, I suppose, even more aligned to China, that Mandarin language skills will be even more in demand. So I do see it as something that will continue. So for anyone with kids in Hong Kong, I encourage them to get them to learn Chinese. Very difficult language to pick up when you're obviously a little bit older. But I still think there are opportunities, yeah. But again, it just means it's probably a slightly, smaller number of opportunities. But again, something else that's happening, which is real to some extent. We are seeing, some expats, leaving Hong Kong, whether it's to do with, the security law or the pandemic, or really just naturally coming to the end, because it is accentuated by the fact that we just have virtually no one coming into Hong Kong at the moment. It just feels like there's more people leaving, but really Hong Kong has always been a massively transient place. But I do feel that, because we are seeing, and it's not a massive exodus like it's in the press, if you ask me, but we are seeing some people leave, and that will create, opportunities as well for, and not necessarily Chinese speakers. So, I'm still, I've been here for 18 years. I think Hong Kong has a amazing capacity to reinvent itself and sort of, redefine what it is and sort of how it's attractive to people. So I still feel, we'll be sitting here in 10 years' time, and Hong Kong will be a great place to work with lots of career opportunities. But yes, I still think Chinese language skills are going to become more and more important. Does that answer your question?
Thank you. Yeah, it does. I felt it. I thought so, and it kind of reiterated my belief, is what I thought. Thank you very much, Chris.
I've got a question from Hader. Any insights on what platforms companies are using for resource and skills hunting? Can I just perhaps ask for clarification? Are we talking about sort of when they're looking for talent, looking to hire talent? Is that what which platforms companies use? Yeah, I mean, I'm very happy to share. I mean, none of these are. I mean, there are a somewhat limited number of sort of decent platforms here in Hong Kong. There are, organized, there's job boards effectively like JobsDB, classifiedpost.com, eFinancials. A very large proportion of larger corporate multinationals and banks will these days have their own in-house talent acquisition teams, and the bulk of hires they would make would come through LinkedIn. So that would be using the RPS licenses, the recruiter licenses on LinkedIn, which give you much greater access in terms of access to passive candidates and ability to send multiple messages and do quite complex searches on candidates. So it's a variety of different methodologies. Job boards like JobsDB and eFin also have their own databases which clients would pay to have access to, and they would go in and do their own searches and then pay per sort of CV downloaded from the platform. And then there's other more interesting, slightly more niche sort of areas. So a lot of the startup businesses here will, have their own job boards or mediums or social media groups, etc., through which they do a lot of hiring. So again, quite a diverse range of sort of methods, really.
And did you see Vivian's question, or?
Sorry, did I miss a question, Charlotte? Or did
Vivian, you want to ask your question?
Yes. Hello. Good morning. Good morning in New York. Yes, I heard of a couple. They're both attorneys, husband and wife, living in Connecticut. The corporate attorneys. They sold their home. They were recruited the wife got recruited for a position in South Korea. And the husband got a position as well. He's also a corporate attorney. They sold their home in Connecticut, took the children, even the pet, the dog, and moved totally in South Korea. And I was just wondering, what, I know we're talking about Singapore and Hong Kong, but this is still South Asia. I was wondering if there is an uptick over there as well, if there is a need in South Korea also for attorneys and finance and, you know, everything that goes together. If there is finance, you need the attorneys to close the contracts, to close the deals. Do you see this uptick there?
I mean, it's very difficult for me to comment with any accuracy, Vivian, because we don't have a physical presence or really recruit into that into Korea at all, South Korea. My sort of own perception of the market there, Vivian, is that you know, is that it's a much smaller expatriate you know, destination than areas like you know, Hong Kong and Singapore, but absolutely there are opportunities. You know, I mean, funnily enough, a good friend of mine has just moved to South Korea as sort of head of a global US pharmaceutical business for the region. So, and he's uprooted his whole family, who's also a lawyer actually, and his kids, and he's taken them there for a 2-year sort of stint. So perhaps you're right, but I honestly couldn't comment too much. I'm sorry.
It's all right. Thank you.
Paul, how's your internet connection? Any last questions for Chris? Paul is having problems. So I just wanted to thank Chris very much for speaking tonight, this morning to us. The fact that we are all over the world is amazing. I do want to introduce Vivian Prusak, who is the Paris chapter co-chair, and also Richard Archer, who is the former UAE chapter chair, who only got out of it because he moved to Thailand. And Chris, if you and I could speak for a moment afterwards, but thank you everybody, and thank you to Paul
Sure.
for arranging this, who is, as you know, our chair for Hong Kong. And I hope everybody stays safe and healthy.